There, my name is PJ Capozzi. I am Superintendent of Schools for Meridian 223. A couple of questions have come up on message boards about the Ed Fund. Uh, and so I just want to take a second to explain this. These are all things that I've tried to explain through the years in our levy presentation, our budget presentation, and the budget at a glance document that we've published for several years. But I want to try to do it in about 5 minutes here and make it as clear as possible so everyone can understand. We receive money into the Ed Fund in really like four different ways. The primary way is the local tax revenue, and that's obviously why we're seeking referendum. The second is general state aid, so that's the money that the state gives to support schools. The third is local fees and other revenues, which I'll explain, but think about it in terms of the student fees that we pay or we ask you guys to pay, etc. And then last is state and federal grants. I'm going to do a deep dive on each so that we can kind of understand where the predominance of the money comes in and why the funding from the referendum has been necessary to support what we have been trying to accomplish. So the primary way that we get funded is through you, the local taxpayer. So the local tax revenue is a function of our tax rate and our local EAV. So our current tax rate in the Ed Fund is 3.48. That's what we are asking the taxpayers to maintain. That brings in a totality of $8.8 million. That tax rate is capped by law. Like I can't change that in terms of increasing it. We could decrease it as a board, but in terms of increasing it, then we have to ask you. And that's quite literally the function of this referendum. If it shifts from year to year, that's as a result of property values. So it's actually kind of been a roller coaster over the last decade. So property values declined, which meant EAV decreased, money coming into the school then decreased, and now EAV is on the upswing. A great question I get asked often is, well, if the EAV goes up 3%, shouldn't that be enough to fund the schools? Aren't you getting more money that way? And so any additional revenue that we have coming in as a result of property values is awesome, but our fixed costs also increase. And I'm not even talking about salaries, which is something to consider, but I'm talking about as we consider what we're paying for electric, gas, waste, water, insurance, all of those things that we either have little to no control over as inflation just generally happens around. That helps to drive up property value, which is great for homeowners. It also has an impact on how things cost. Is that always going to be one-to-one? No, it certainly isn't. Some cases, EAV will outpace inflation. Other cases, inflation outpaces EAV. Two other quick little notes. We get a little chunk of money in two separate leases that flow into the education fund. That is the lease fund, of which we can lease things. So one of the things we commonly lease are like copiers in terms of our, we don't own the copiers that are in our buildings frequently. Sometimes we do if we find a great deal, but most likely those are our leased items. And also we are able to have a little bit of taxation to help support our special education. Second biggest chunk that we get is in general state aid. So the state uses their formula and says this is the amount of money you get. They will tell you that they are significantly kind of behind what we should need. The general state aid, when that comes in, as I've explained to people that have come to the town halls, like we have buckets of money that once something's in education, we have to spend it in education. Once something's in buildings and grounds, we have to spend it in buildings and grounds, unless there's a formalized board-approved fund transfer. So when the general state aid comes in, we have the ability to place it in whatever bucket we choose. We put 95+% of that revenue into the Ed Fund because that's where we're trying to concentrate our efforts. One thing is like this money is not earmarked, meaning that when it comes from the state, we don't have to spend it on any certain things. Like no program from the state that we are currently funded with is taken care of directly through this program. We do have to give significant documentation on how we're trying to support our English language learners. Now, the state does offer some grant funding which would take care of entire programs. The one that normally happens is for the pre-kindergarten program. Currently, we do not have that grant. We apply for it every year, and if we get it, then that would pay for the pre-kindergarten program. We don't, so that's something that we pay for currently. The third area, which we don't get a ton of revenue in from, is local fees and other revenue. So just to understand fees, obviously our kids pay roughly $150 per year. It changes per grade level to attend school. By law, we can only charge that to our students who are not free and reduced. So we typically bring in around $150,000 a year on that, which again, in an $18-19 million budget, helps, right? Like every bit helps, but that's not a significant area. The way the local money that we bring in the most from is selling food through breakfast and lunch. Directly from the consumer, and then also from some reimbursements for our students who are free and reduced. The issue with food service is that we are by code not allowed to make profit on this. So at best, our food service tends to be a break-even venture. And then also, whenever we have money that we can put into the bank and put into short-term CDs that allow us to be liquid enough to have money if we need to access it, but we can also procure some additional revenue by putting it in, then we have been very, I would say, conservatively aggressive in. And the last one thing I want to talk about is grants and other federal sources. So the federal government supports us in Title 1, 2, and 4. The intent of Title is to help us directly support our typically underserved populations. So if we had a higher level of free and reduced or socioeconomically challenged individuals, we would probably get more title money. It kind of works as a direct function of that. And so that's one way we receive money. The second is we get a fractional reimbursement when we serve Medicaid eligible students. And then the last is we have another grant that comes that flows through us directly for special education. Again, that grant is around $300,000, and that's awesome, but it certainly doesn't fund our entire special education program. I've seen kind of going around on message boards, I just kind of want to directly address, is that, well, it doesn't matter about the positions they added because those are all funded by grants. When the role of school finance is that everything is kind of put into the categories or buckets that it belongs into. And so if we took out $1.3 million out of the education fund bucket, then we'd have to cut $1.3 million out of the education fund bucket. All of the things that have been shared publicly as potential cuts are directly out of the education fund bucket. So I'm not sure exactly where that comes from. The other thing is that we have money stashed in a general fund, or we should have earmarked money that we saved over time, or the referendum money should have been earmarked. Again, we have $14+ million flowing into the education fund, of which we spend that on a line item per line item basis, and it's approved and budgeted with each line item denoted for, and the board gets monthly updates on that. So at the beginning of the year, we predict as much of the expenses as we can. Obviously, in a year with an organization this big, you can't predict every expense, but we do our best job at prognosticating. And at that point, funds are earmarked, but we don't have anything that's set aside that says this is just referendum funds, or this is just the money that we are saving by not having to pay back the landfill. That's just not how it works. And then the last thing is, well, they can just find additional ways to get the $1.3 million. There is no possible way for us just to make $1.3 million arrive. And if we did, that would impact the tax rate, and that would be really disingenuous if we could. So in the vast majority of our funds, we are at the legal limit of what we can tax. And so there is no additional way to procure those things. So whatever is getting kind of tossed about, I just wanted to make sure those are clarified. Again, the role of the district is just to provide factual information so that people can make an informed decision. I understand that this is an incredibly private, personal choice, and I significantly appreciate that. But I just want to make sure that in terms of some of the things that I'm seeing that just either don't make sense or I'm not getting questions about that are getting bandied about, I just want to make sure that I was clarifying those for everyone. Thank you, and make it a great day.